So to define participation rate just means what percentage of all patients who walk through your door get represented by a photo intake. Okay, so our numerator would be number of intakes, and our denominator is just all your new patients, however you want to measure that. Completion rate is then what percentage of all intakes get a completed episode. And as you know, you're photo users, so that you know that a completed episode is at a minimum at least one status and the staff discharge to get a completed episode. So then the number of intakes becomes our denominator. So what we're talking about is foundationally our largest number then is all new patients who walk through the door, and then how many of those are participating and how many of those then get completed episodes. A little background. I want to briefly review the reasons why a patient might not end up getting a photo intake. So if someone, say you've got them set up on photo and then they come in and they can't take the intake because of maybe some of the reasons listed on this slide, we just ask you to document that. And there's a process that we've fine-tuned in the last few months. We have a process now. If they don't get an intake, we say they're not participating. And there's a process by which you select the reason why they're not participating, and then the episode gets cleared out of your queue for you. Once they've had an intake, there are lots of reasons why they might not get a status. And again, if you can't get a status on that patient, the process now is that you follow the incomplete discharge process and you document the reason why they didn't get a status. This has also been fine-tuned in the last few months that you may have noticed. The ones in orange, I think, are kind of, iffy. There may be some opportunities to get a status in a lot of these examples in the orange. The one that's in red, I just didn't get it. I just didn't get it. For whatever reason, that might be the area that I can work the most on. So what's the big deal about completion rates and participation rates? Well, it's about validity, and it's about having a foundation on which to improve our outcomes. So to talk about that, validity, by definition, means does it measure what we say it does? Does it do what it say we say it does? So when I'm going out and I'm saying, these are my outcomes, are they measuring what I say they do? Are they measuring my patient population? So if you kind of compare it to a research study, if you had a research study with a really high dropout rate, how much would you trust those results? And another consideration is improving outcomes. If I want to improve my outcomes, I kind of got to make sure I know what they are first. So how can I improve my outcomes if I don't know what they are? So I've got to make sure my participation rate and completion rates are high enough that when I look at my outcomes, I can say those are my outcomes, and now I can say, oh yeah, here's where I need to improve, and so on. So if you want to improve your outcomes, start by getting your sample size as close to this as you can. So if you remember from Statistics 101, the good old bell-shaped curve, and inherent in the bell-shaped curve is normal variability. The higher your sample size, or the stronger your participation and completion rates, the closer you can get to this. And that way, when you have those outliers, you can afford it, and it's normal variability of your population. For example, the patient example that we did this morning in the neuro case, maybe that was an outlier where the patient came in rating a 62 at their intake, where the national average was 30-something. If I've got more patients, I'm going to be more able to have that normal variability. So that's one reason to get your sample size up. Now, I can tell you from experience, when you look at increasing participation rates and completion rates, if you're like me, you have a little nigging in the back of your mind that worries a little bit. Once we increase our rates, is it going to harm our outcomes? And I can tell you back in 2008, when I was involved in doing this at my facility, that was in the back of my mind. What's going to happen to our outcomes when we have more patients? But Mark pulled this data for us, and he was able to point out, we always like these data-driven statements. The data shows that the odds are overwhelmingly in our favor when we increase our rates. So for example, when the lumbar data has been examined, 70%, more than 70% of patients with lumbar data that they looked at exceeded the MCII values, and the majority achieved the predicted FS. So the odds are in your favor, and I can tell you that when we increased our participation completion rates, our outcomes did not go down. So that was nice. Another way of looking at this is a study that Mark Pold published by Dr. Hart and Associates in 2010, a sample of 17,000 patients with low back pain looking at their intake FS scores. And you can see, as far as this variability, 93% of the patients were somewhere between this 20 and 70 score. Okay, 93% were between those scores, with very few at the ends. And you know, Mark and I are talking about using outcomes as a skill, and using patient-reported outcomes in our clinical decision-making and in patient care. It's a skill to develop, just like when I went back to school and learned about lumbar manipulation. You know, it's a skill. And as we develop those skills, the idea is that your curve can shift. So what's achievable? So back to our little model. The terms participation rate and completion rates were first coined in 2008 when Dr. Daniel Deutscher and Associates published their study where they described how they implemented photo across Maccabi Healthcare in Israel. And at that time, so they described their new implementation and described all the different aspects, and one of the things they reported on was their completion and participation rates. So features of this study, there were multiple sites, and we know the more sites you have, the more challenging it can be to implement and maintain photo. They had an integrated electronic medical record, which at the time was kind of novel, I thought. So their sample size, they had 24,000 new patients that year that they looked at. So of all the patients who walked through their door, 24,000. In that first year, across the 12 months, they had about 16,000 intakes, and about 5,000 ended up with completed episodes. So there are the numbers that we can plug in to seeing how it went for them when they first described it. This is kind of a busy slide for a PowerPoint, or a busy table for a PowerPoint, but if you'll just look at the hashed lines show their completion rates across the 12-month period. So you can see from the first month when they started, by the end they were getting up a good 45% the past couple of months. Again, this is just their first year of implementation. But you can see when working at it, they improved. So again, we plug in our numbers, the numbers from the last slide. They had a participation rate of 67%, and their completion rate averaged across the 12 months was 31, but by the end they were getting to 45%. This is a slide from QI data that I presented in the 2010 photo conference, and I brought it back just to share once again how humbling it can be when you pull the data. This was our data. In 2008, I was coordinating photo outcomes at our 15-site outpatient hospital facilities at St. Vincent, and we were overhauling photo anyway because we were going to PI Web, and we were the beta test site for PI Web, so we were overhauling anyway. And at the same time, I had a chance to pull our number of new evaluation charges, and that's what I used to generalize how many new patients. And I sat down and plugged in the numbers, which we hadn't done this before. We hadn't really thought about it. But I was able to see that of all the patients who walked through our door, 18% of them were being represented by our photo outcomes. And this was very humbling. Our director, who has always been the force behind our participation in photo, is very supportive of data. We've always been very proud of our outcomes. Our outcomes have been good. She'd used our photo outcomes to leverage managed care contracts and a number of other things. Very valuable for us. So you can imagine that when I brought this to her and gave her that 18%, it didn't sit well with her. So she said we needed to clean house. So we took this opportunity of needing to overhaul photo anyway at our sites, and worked on our participation and completion rates. So this is another example of when you work at it, it can happen. The top line is our participation rate. So of all the patients who walk through our door represented by new evaluation charges, how many of those got a photo intake? And you can see we started at about 68% and went to 83%. I can tell you at the smaller clinics had no problem getting well into 90% for participation rate. Our completion rate, our completion rate improved to, it ended up being 58% is what it was. Looks like 60 on here. So you can see that improved nicely. The bottom line was a different criteria that we held ourselves to. For lack of calling it anything better, I called it our overall completion rate because this represented the number of patients who walked through our door who got completed episodes. So that's an even higher standard that's kind of above and beyond what we're talking about today. But again, working at it, things can improve. So that was just QI data, what's been published. So back to Dr. Deutscher's study in 2008. And you can see there are other studies that have been published using photo data that report participation and or completion rates. So some things to pull out in the participation rate column, you can see that for new user, 67%, but for mature users, there was a 78 to 81% as far as what's been published. Completion rates for mature users has ranged from 57 to 75%. And an interesting part of that, I always find it really valuable when someone has the kind of data where they can assess how many of these people who didn't complete were just dropouts from therapy. Michelle Young calls them FOFIs, fall off the face of the earth, right, Michelle? So the FOFIs, for lack of a better term. But I thought it was really interesting to see documentation on what dropout rates are. I thought that was helpful because that's certainly a component of incompletion rate, if you will. So we have a data-driven recommendation that you consider looking at this in your sites. And we recommend that you consider, as mature users, not new implementers, but as mature users, striving for 80 to 90%. Consider setting a goal and pull these numbers. Completion rates, like we said, what's been published, it appears somewhere between 57 to 75%. Now, I want to point out that the 75%, for example, they were working hard. This was Mark's research group in a relatively small group. They had a 15% therapy dropout, which is awesome. But they were pushing really hard, as Mark will tell us. But it can be done. So there's this range that we have. So if I want to increase my participation rates and my completion rates, what are some things can we do? So just going to go over some feedback tools, some ideas, suggestions for you, and clinical tips and management tips. For participation rate, obviously this isn't information that Photo has. Photo doesn't know how many patients walk through your door. That's your data. And this would be a number that you'd get internally that you could keep for yourself. So somehow get your number of new patients. I told you at St. Vincent we just used our number of new evaluation charges, and that was pretty close. And then you take your number of photo intakes. Sometimes in an electronic medical record you might have an easy place you can look. This is an example of a redoc screen where they just show number of new evaluations. Again, because Photo is not able to provide you with what your participation rate is, this is just an example of an Excel document that you could just do internally. So you can see the first section across a 12-month period, number of new evaluations, that's your internal data. So plugging that in, how many, and then pulling in number of photo intakes, and then number of completed episodes from your photo reports. So there you have your numerators and your denominators. So when you plug those in, then you have what your facility's participation rate is. You might want to put what your goal is. We just threw that in there so that we had it. Those were our goals at the time, 83% and 59%. And the 12-month snapshots, I think, are usually the most accurate because some of the variables fall out. Maybe you had a lot of intakes at the beginning of the month versus the end of the month or whatever. So I always prefer to look at the 12-month snapshot if I can, but of course quarters are great to show trends and improvement. By the way, with participation rates, one of the things I'm hoping that at least someone will share is I'd be really interested to know how many of you are tracking participation rates, whether you have to for a payer situation or because you're doing it yourself. Is anyone looking at your participation rates? Yeah, oh, lovely. I hope that when we get to the Q&A part, I'd love to hear how you're doing it and things about that. Other feedback tools, if you go to the photo portal, there is a column that will show you your completion rate. So the photo portal is another tool. And on the photo portal, as always, you can sort it by clinic, by clinician. I believe you can track your clinician's completion rate. Where's Trish? Okay, I'm pretty sure you can do it by clinician too. Okay, Daphne's nodding her head, thank you. By care type, ortho, neuro, and so on. So keep the portal in mind. I'm old school photo. I still like the outcomes profile, and this is what I go to. On the page 1 of your outcomes profile, where the yellow arrow is showing, it's got what you need for the completion rates from photo. So if we blow that up, it's nice. It nicely has the 12-month roll-up, and then the quarter-only reports, and it gives number of patients in FS. That means how many completed episodes, how many intakes, and then photo calculates there for us what this particular unit, however I've sorted it, what their completion rate was compared to what the photo benchmark is doing these days. So another feedback tool. Photo recently, we're doing more things to make it easier for our users to track your completion rates and to help improve. And one of the things is this nifty little completion rate gauge that you may have noticed on PI Web. Okay, some heads nodding. It just appeared recently. It's a 30-day window. So don't be freaked out if it varies from time to time, because you know if you have a lot of intakes at the beginning of the month, you may not have as many new patients that you're seeing later and so on. So keep that in mind, but keeping an eye on that 30-day can be a nice immediate feedback for you. As far as clinical tips, the bottom line is don't wait till discharge to get that first status, and you've been hearing that in different ways already throughout the conference. Another one of the things that I hope we'll get to talk about at the end is what are some tips to get those statuses sooner than the last visit? Whether you're doing serial statuses or even just trying to make sure that you're not waiting until the last visit to get their status. And there are a number of really important reasons to do that in the context of this, in completion rates. Don't wait until discharge because they might not come back for their last visit. Management tips. This is a summary of what users over the years have reported at this conference. We always have someone get up and talk about how they implement, how they manage, how they market with photo. And over the years, there have been themes that have emerged, and I just wanted to briefly summarize some of those. Why is photo important? That's a management tip because it's just Leadership 101. Make sure everybody understands the value, understands why photo is important to your organization, to clinical care. Make sure that that message gets carried through to everyone. Accountability. If you have the need to institute some kind of accountability within your annual reviews or what have you related to photo, consider tying it to completion rates and participation rates before the outcomes. So as an example, if your front office staff is who is responsible for setting up the patients on intake, could a participation rate be their accountability? If your therapists are responsible for the statuses and the discharge, could your therapists have the accountability for a certain completion rate so that everybody's striving toward those goals? And then you've got good data that you can sit back and look at and say, oh, here's where we could stand to do some continuing ed or some mentoring or whatever and use that. Recognition, we had this morning Josh and Ryan talking about recognizing associates, employees for their photo outcomes. Recognize them for their completion rates, first and foremost. Looking at outcomes before completion rates, I think, is putting the cart before the horse. Look at those completion rates and recognize folks for that. And then photo champions. You've already heard that this morning. They already talked about the importance of photo champions. That's just another theme that has emerged. As I said, at Photo, we're trying to do more things this year to help our users, make it easier for users to track your completion rates and to improve those. So if you're looking for help, our provider relations folks have put together this nifty little document, and they're armed and ready to help you. So give them a call if you have questions about that. So we have plenty of time for Q&A, which is what I wanted.
You talk about new and mature clinics. At what point in time do you shift from that new to mature? I know it's different organizations, but we're so busy rolling out to a variety of facilities right now. When do we start seeing some of that change happen in most organizations?
So the shift from mature to a mature clinic, I don't have an answer for that.
And we looked at this over 3 years between 2011, 12, and 13. This is Daniel's internal study done in the fall of 2014. And it was interesting to watch the level of performance change over time. And what we looked at and what we consider as a mature user, probably 3 years of experience. Okay? And their outcomes are much higher than those having only that first year of implementation. So that doesn't really answer, but it's a good benchmark to get an idea on how to establish mature versus new users. I think that's fair. So it's a good skill to learn, takes some time.
Then my follow-up with that is any of you that have already done this, have you ramped up your goals from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 as you went through the process for some of you that have done it a little bit longer?
Obviously, your management and administration would be involved in looking at that. So they would probably, what would be reasonable is to start out at a very low baseline for new users. So what was that participation, 67%?
It was 67.
And then at the end of 3 years, you should have a progressive goal-setting process so that at the mature time, it should be at least 80%, 80 to 85% may be a good goal.
80 to 90 seems reasonable for
Okay.
participation from what we can tell at this point.
Yeah.
I know that in 2014 there was a change in the completion rate and how that was calculated and was given to us. So prior to that, we used the 65% because that was what was recommended, and we were doing fantastic. And then in 2014, the new calculation came out, and all of a sudden it looked like, well, we're not doing as good as we thought we were doing. So that had a little negative feedback on our staff. They're like, well, we thought we were doing so good, but really we're not. Well, okay, we've got to figure out how to change that. So I'm assuming that the standard that you're giving is for the new way that they're kind of calculating the completion rate. Does that make sense?
It's for the new way.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. We had the same experience. Like,
Yeah.
oh, well, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
And fortunately, we had already been looking at it the other way too. But I hear you. So what she's getting at is, in the past, Photo was considering a completion rate with the denominator based on the number of patients who had both an intake and a staff discharge. And what we've evolved to is just those who have an intake is the denominator now. Yeah, my report's got a little different too. Would someone who said they're tracking participation rates be willing to share a little bit about that? Maybe why you do it and how you do it?
It's pretty simplistic. At our largest clinic, we just have a graph on the wall behind the front desk, and they know that we have 12 evals in a day. They put that in a circle, and then dependent upon how many intakes we do, they put that in a triangle. So it's graphed every single day of the week.
Wow.
So the front desk knows that that has to get filled out. Therapists can walk by and look at it. I can walk by and look at it. And it's just a big sheet of paper with circles and triangles.
And are you a relatively new user, or?
No, we've been doing this for a while.
Okay.
You know, it might change after we've heard everything, but that seems to work for us.
Nice. So that in itself is accountability, wouldn't you say? Thank you.
That's a great idea for visibility. I think it's very important when you just start using photo, because you need to get intakes in first in order to have the opportunity to collect data.
Good point. If you don't have the intakes, you don't know what it is.
We get all of our patients in photo because we have an aide with OCD who puts them in, which I would recommend you all get yourself one of those, who actually enters the evals the day before. And when that happens, now the ownership becomes on the therapist, and monitoring participation and cleaning up your incomplete each quarter. When I send out a nice reminder that the quarter's ending, you've got to go in and do an NP for anybody that didn't show up for the eval. So now we have a realistic database in photo that also tells us just how many people didn't show up for an eval, which frankly, when they come through our EMR, if they don't show up for an eval, there's no way to monitor that because they actually get removed because they didn't become a formal chart. Does that make sense? So in photo, we can actually track then how many non-participatory no-show for evals did we have.
Let's come up with tips for the day on how to get those statuses.
In our scheduling module, there's a line on the right-hand side where you can indicate notes. And it's the responsibility of the therapist to go into the scheduling module a visitor to ahead of when you want to do a photo status. And you simply write photo, please. And our wonderful front office says, oh, when they run the schedule in the morning, they look at and they highlight in yellow who's doing a photo for that day. So, and they get those prepared ahead of time, so when the patient comes in, it's simply, they do the wonderful scripting and then hand that off to the patient. They complete the photo, it's in our box before we even see them for the day. So that has worked out phenomenally for us. And then they've got scripting as to what to expect in that status survey. I was going to ask you about your functional status. We want you to answer that honestly based on how you're doing currently. The next series of questions is going to be about your satisfaction. We want you to answer those honestly. So if there's something we can do to improve, we want to know about it. And then the third, then there's some questions about pain, and they go through a little bit about that. And the patients, we don't really have too many people that get grumbly about it. It works out really well for us.
That's nice, and I like what you ended on. It's a great example of if you impart the value, what you value, so shall your patient. And so they don't get grumpy about it when they know you value it.
We sit down and go through it with them, and they love when I'm like, hey, look at what you're beating the national average. They're like, woohoo! They feel fantastic about that. So I think when they see that, they're like, I'm better than the other guy. They really get a kick out of that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Excellent.
So for your statuses, your front desk staff does it with them before their treatment that day? Do you ask them to come in early that day? Because my patients usually walk in at their appointment time. So the therapists that are deciding, so they're telling them on the appointment time of previous, your next appointment, come in 10 minutes early? Okay.
Status is a little different. I don't care if they take it before or after this treatment session. It's not the intake. So the therapist should be looking at that data during that visit anyway to prepare his next lesson plan. So sometime during that visit it should be taken. I'm not sure if it's critical it has to be before or after. Well, you know, nuances of clinical practice. You know, my patients come in late too.
Sorry, I thought I was singing karaoke there. Just to that point, I mean, I love all the things that you're doing, and I think those are great. But you mentioned there that you didn't care whether they did it before their therapy session or after their therapy session. Just purely from a managerial standpoint, we have made sure that all our patients do them after their therapy session, because perhaps that's a bad day. Perhaps they had a flare-up the night before, and now we're going to capture them at their worst. Not the 4 visits that they were there the days before, doing very well, before they had that weekend in the yard. And then perhaps that's the last status that we got because of perhaps not getting another status before their final discharge, so that becomes our final discharge. So we final discharge that patient when our front office took a status when they were at their worst before the therapist had an opportunity to waive off that status. So as an organization, what we have done is the therapist must give it to them, but the therapist has to be alerted by front office, support staff in the back office, the therapists themselves need to do it, and then there's extra accountability on their exercise flow sheet. But I wanted the therapists to be able to have the opportunity to say, okay, this is abnormal today, they were doing well, let's get that status next visit in, because we're going to work differently on the flare-up that they had.
I'm not going to be very popular, but I come in about 45 minutes early every day, and I plan out my lesson plans, and I decide when and where I want to do statuses. So if you get your therapist motivated to come in 45 minutes early, that's a great thing. I don't know how you're going to do it, but but anyway, you take ownership. That's basically what it is, because you want that information to improve your visit, your treatment, I mean.
So to summarize it, it does seem key to have a system. Whatever system works for you to get those statuses done, that's the key with the statuses. One of my favorite tips is to clinically always make sure that I set a photo goal. The functional status measure will improve to whatever over 100, and that way at least, hopefully I've been doing statuses more often than that, but at least when I go to do my progress note, I'm looking for it, and that'll cue me, hey, before you leave today, would you please stop by the computer, let me set you up, because I'm going to reassess you next time. It's also good for clinical reasons too, because it helps me be more outcomes focused in my clinical decision making, but that's that too. Any other ideas for getting those statuses done, or anything else that you want to discuss or ask about completion rates and participation rates?
I have one, Deanna.
Yes, ma'am. This is Julie.
From my old support days, I used to suggest that clinics put a note on the front door that says, have you taken your status today? And then they can at least prompt the front desk, do I need to take my status today? So that was just one that I used to instruct clinics to do.
Very nice. Good. Well, thank you for your participation today and your thought processes. We're looking forward to continuing this at 5. Did you have another?
Yeah, just one thing. Please take a look at the patient instructions for intake and status. Just give us feedback, and we'll be discussing that in more detail at 5 o'clock. So if you have a peek, just let us know. If this is going to be rolled out as is, how should it be tweaked or not tweaked?
Just have one more thing related to what you were just talking about, because I think that's a fantastic idea, because that'll help us to make sure the patients are understanding, because the instructions you have that you created now are simplistic enough for people to understand, and it's not cumbersome. Could you also make something to transition them into the fear questions?
We're going to tackle the fear question head on this afternoon.
Perfect. Okay.
Thanks, everybody. See you later.